How do you normally study a book? I bet first thing you do, get the physical book and read it through. Maybe read it again. Some books you haven't really read till you've read twice. Or maybe in English class, you're all going to a certain page and saying, I'm going to look at this word by word. I'm going to take this poem line by line, and I'm going to really say, like, well, what does that mean? What's going on there? Maybe I'll look at it only in the context of the text. Maybe that's all that matters to me is the poem itself. Maybe I'll look at it in context of history and other books and other poems. And that gets us to close reading, where we literally look deeply at it. Maybe we memorize it. Maybe we have it where it's just available to us at all times because it's in our heads. We've learned it by rote. And then we can keep thinking about it and keep meditating on it. And that has a place. That's very important. That's something that I hope you have in your English classes. And you have experience like this when you're looking at a textbook and thinking, I really need to know this, or how do I understand this? That idea of interpretation. But it's inherently a narrow way of looking at text. With historical texts, literary texts, whatever. It narrows us down to we have only a certain slice of text that are called the canon. And that's something that we've inherited from religious views of text, where you'd have this rule where there'd be scriptures, what would be authoritative in a particular religion. And that's gone over into secular literary studies in a sense of what do you read in college? What do professors study? And there's kind of a genealogy of it. I studied something in undergrad, and then I give it to you in an English class. And that narrowness, what that leads to is a justice issue. Voices are excluded. And we saw that with last week's video with our look at archives. What's being digitized? Because when it takes time and labor, that narrows down to what you make available. But are there biases? Because there's research decisions being made. Who's being excluded? Who's not in the canon? How are you having a skewed view of history because you're being given a narrow slice of text? And that gives you an impression of like, that's what was happening. Here's an example. I told you before I'm a Victorianist, so I studied the Victorian era, and I focused specifically on the poet Hopkins, and we'll talk about him in the canon a little bit later. But we had this view in Victorian studies called the secularization narrative. That's the idea that faith was in decline in British society of the era, that there's more room for agnosticism, more room for atheism. And in the canonical text, that really holds up. You may have had Thomas Hardy, maybe one of his books in the English class, or George Eliot, some of her novels in English class. And so Thomas Hardy really has this narrative of this death of God concept, death of God theology. He has a poem called God's Funeral. So it makes lots of sense. And George Eliot, she has this idea of the secular religion of sympathy. So when we read canonical texts, we think, oh, this is an age of decline in faith. That's a close reading of those texts too. If we do more of a distant reading, where we can see more texts across time, or if we think about what's being read by people of the time, then we see that it's actually John Keeble's The Christian Year is its most purchased, most read text. And what that book does is it leads readers through poems that go through the liturgical year of the Anglican Church. And so that suggests that maybe secularization isn't a decline in faith, but more of an allowance of a plurality of faiths. And that's what the secularization narrative is more now. Comes from someone called Charles Taylor, where there's more of a plurality. There's more of openness for Hardy's agnosticism, George Eliot's religion of sympathy, but also there's people reading John Keeble's Christian Year. And so with the narrow canonical reading, we miss out on text. Voices are marginalized. And that's something you can explore with distant reading throughout this new unit, where you're thinking about, I'm going to look at different texts. I'm going to look across texts, and I'm going to see what emerges. And you'll get that with the readings later. What I like to do more in this video now is let's think about close and distant reading and what their relationship is. Because when I point out that the canon is narrow and exclusive, I don't mean to say that we dump the idea of close reading. It's still necessary. But we look at how distant reading, where we look at text in a database and do statistical analysis, where distant reading can then help you with your close readings and vice versa. So first, let's go. I said we were talking more about Hopkins there. That's the poet I work on. And as far as relation to the canon, he is now canonical. You have probably read him in an English class, in high school, or in college. You probably had the poem Spring and Fall or Pied Beauty. They're often anthologized. But he would have been excluded early on. He lived from 1844 to 1889. He was not published till 1918 in a book, not this particular book, but this collection of poems by his friend Robert Bridges. And so canon formation sort of moves around where there are people who are excluded, who are then included. He's still an example of a dead white male, though, so we still have the problem of how we're being exclusive of diverse voices. But I want to think about him in the sense of how I use close readings and distant readings when working with him. So let's say if I want to do a close reading, I may have his collected works. I may open to a poem. Maybe it'll be Spring and Fall. Maybe I'll memorize that poem and I'll think of Margaret, are you grieving over Golden Grove unleaving? So it's very available to me. And think about those different words. He's a poet that really lends himself to that, where I can think of, okay, Golden Grove, he's making a word there. What's going on? But even though I know his poems very well, I'll miss things, really things that distant reading can help me with. So let's say I want to do textual analysis to find out what's the most common word in his poems. Let's take a look at that right now. So what you're seeing right now is a visualization of these poems. It's a different version. It's the one from Project Gutenberg. So it's the 1918 edition. And this is a newer edition. It has some poems that were discovered in the archive. And you're seeing a representation of one of the most common words, which is heart. I would not off the top of my head have guessed that from my close readings, but when I saw it, I was not surprised. And so heart is used a lot. There's his heart in hiding is stirred for a bird in the wind hover. Heart is used so much in his large ode, The Wreck of the Deutschland. And that's where the heart and the host relationship there. So that could be useful, but what if I don't have close reading experience? What if I don't know all those things? Then I might be thinking, okay, what are these in context? So I moved to distant reading saying, okay, computer, what's the most common word? And then how does that word map onto other words? And I have a visualization. But I need to have that close reading knowledge where I go back to the text. I say, okay, heart and host are linked. That's probably Wreck of the Deutschland. And I see where it is in the context of the text. There's also ways, though, where my knowledge of the poet is useful here. So that's where the context of the poet's life, the close reading of the poetry, and the distant reading all intermingle. Because I know the poems aren't all there is. He was a priest. He had sermons. They weren't necessarily very good sermons. He was a better poet, but he has them. So I can see in his devotional writings, he writes about this concept of the Sacred Heart. So I can then go and like, oh, here's theological aspects of this Jesuit priest that's going into his poetry and his devotional writings, and the computer helped me see that I can make those connections. But that's not the only way to do distant readings. You can have intimate knowledge of the text, but you can also explore texts that you've never read before that were popular. And that's why last time I showed you this idea of the Yellowback novel, that was a very popular Victorian text. That's what you would read on the train. And so we have the canonical novels, George Eliot, Thomas Hardy, the people I mentioned when I talked about the secularization narrative. We also have these popular novels that we can look through the collections in a library and an archive, and then pull it into a tool like Voyant for textual analysis. So those are different ways to kind of do close and distant reading. Speaking of popular text, why don't we consider a popular text in relation to the more canonical text of Hopkins? Let's say I want to work on Lord of the Rings. I could do a close reading. I could read it through. There are some people who reread it every year. And that could get me a lot of things. I could say, okay, I want to think about how food and feast happen here. So I'm going to go into the Rivendell scenes and things like that. That could be a close reading. But with a distant reading, I can complement that close reading and find other things about it. Let's take a look at that. So what you're seeing here is the Lord of the Rings trilogy digitized and put into Voyant. So we can do textual analysis with that. So we can start with the physical book and do a close reading and read over passages again and take notes and make meaning with that and make arguments with that. We can also digitize the physical books, make sure through character recognition that machines can read them, and then put that, it's called a corpus, where you kind of cleaned it up, you've made it where it can be useful for textual analysis, and then put into a tool like Voyant. And let's say before I was thinking about, oh, I want to read about the feasts and things like that. But then maybe that gets me thinking, I wonder how joy operates in the text. How does that word operate? And what I can do is I can go through and say in Voyant, joy, put an asterisk so I can get any different version. Because see, it's joys, joyously, joyfully, joyful. See the word counts. And I can see there's a trend from fellowship to Two Towers to Return of the King. There's this trend where joy is increasing. But then I say, I want to go back to my close reading knowledge, my reading of the text before using a computer, and say, oh, that makes sense. There's this narrative of eucatastrophe where the eagles are coming and the eagles save the day. And so joy would increase. But then I might think, well, now that I've done a close reading and then a distant reading, and I've had that knowledge interact with each other, maybe I want to use the machine to do a close reading. So I have the trend, then I go into context and say, okay, where is joy operating in the text itself? How is joy related to other words? So there's joy and swords, and we can add that in too. And so distant reading is something that's new, something that's exciting, well, new relatively, but close reading is still important. We need both. And when we bring in new voices too, when we think of distant reading in the sense of what voices are excluded, that then invites us to do close readings for those texts that have been excluded. And so this week, think about, with the text that you've chosen, what do you want to do with that text? Because we still have this idea of play and experimentation. Put it in the Voyant, play with it. Think about what words come up. What trends do you see? Because you're in the exploratory phase. And remember, like I said before, play and experimentation, those are core values in digital humanities.